All right, guys, today we're talking about the People's Democratic Party, PDP. And many of us don't know what is going on inside the PDP. And today I am ready to bring you up to speed with all you need to know, probably step by step, because the PDP Supreme Court judgment is one of those Nigerian political stories where most people shouted victory even before reading the fine print. And in a classic Nigerian fashion, some side were already celebrating, only for them to discover that the judgment gave them something with the left and then quietly collected it back with the right. So let's get into the sequence. First, it is important for us to register the fact that the crisis did not begin today. The political crisis in the People's Democratic Party began mid-late 2025, and it was not over ideology or policy. As usual, it was over party control, who controls the structure, and ultimately who controls 2027. And that is the real fight. So, where do we begin? On November 15 and 16, 2025, the faction of the PDP went to Ibadan and they held a national convention. It was that convention, remember, that suspended Wike, Samuel and Fayose with the rest of the people. This was the convention that was backed by Turaki's faction. This scam politically aligned with Say Makinde, Sule Lamado, and the rest of them. They held a convention and came out claiming that they had produced legitimate party leadership. But then, let us count our words properly so we are not misunderstood. So it's important we understand ourselves because Anyanwu was first suspended in November 1st, 2025 under the leadership of Umar Damagu. He announced the suspension of Anyanwu as National Secretary along with a few others. So the suspension was framed as disciplinary moves, even when politically it was a move against Wike's allies. So we can now proceed. So the Supreme Court on April 30, 2026 later addressed these actions by nullifying the Ibadan Convention. The Supreme Court now upheld the suspension of Anyanwu, who was earlier suspended in November 2025 under the leadership of Umar Dagumo. I hope you do understand. So by upholding that suspension, what the court has now done is to cause a complication for Anyanwu's role in Wike-backed structure. So this is where the old trouble is started. But then let's hold this thought. But let's take our minds back to note that before that convention was held where Wike was suspended, the Federal High Court in Abuja on October 31st, 2025 had already restrained the PDP from holding that convention, even though they went ahead and held the convention. So the court did say that the party did not comply with its own constitution, the Electoral Act, and the 1999 Constitution, and even INEC guidelines. So in that vein, the court has said that the process was defective. The court also restrained INEC from recognizing any outcome from the convention if PDP went ahead. That wasn't just a warning. So what happened was, as we already could see, the Turaki camp went ahead anyways with their convention. Now, try to hold that thought. While we take you forward, we need to also bring you backward. So while Turaki's camp held that convention in Ibadan, the Wike's camp were not just watching. They decided to also hold their own convention in Abuja. And that is what happened. So in March 2026, Wike's camp held its own convention in Abuja. This was their response to the Ibadan Convention, their own parallel structure. And so the Wike's camp now produced Abdurrahman Mohammed as their chairman and Samuel Anyanwu again retained as National Secretary. Do not forget that Samuel Anyanwu was suspended by the Umar Dagumo's led committee back then in November 2025. So what we are now watching then before this ruling of 30th April was two conventions, two factions, two leadership claims, one party, and endless confusion. So naturally, both sides went to court claiming legitimacy. So the case climbed from the Federal High Court to the Court of Appeal and then to the Supreme Court. And then we are talking about the Supreme Court judgment. Although we've mentioned it earlier on, but this is where the conversation is about to start. So on April 30, 2026, the Supreme Court finally spoke. Now, this is where most people stop listening, but this is where you need to listen. Now, let's go again. The court nullified the entire Ibadan Convention. That is to say, Turaka's faction, the Seyi Makinde's camp, everything from that convention was voided, its executives voided, its resolutions voided, its legitimacy all gone. Why? because the Supreme Court agreed that the Ibadan Convention was held in defiance of existing court orders. So legally, that was the end of the story for Turaki's scams claim. Now, this was the part that apparently Wike stood before the cameras to celebrate. But the judgment hit the knife in the second paragraph, which is the most important paragraph. Like you can see, I am close, so come closer. Because the weekend scam was celebrating the death of Ibadan, but the judgment also had quietly opened the grave under Abuja. This is the part people miss. Yes, the Supreme Court destroyed Ibadan, but the judgment also raised much bigger questions for Wike's side. Because once Ibadan was struck down, the legal chain that followed also began to collapse. The real landmine in this judgment was not Ibadan. It was Samuel Anyao. And to understand why, you have to understand what the office of the National Secretary actually means in Nigerian politics. The office of the National Secretary is the engine room. The National Secretary issues notices. It is the National Secretary that signs official party correspondence. It is the National Secretary that transmits party resolutions. The National Secretary is one key officer that gives administrative life to the party. So in practical terms, we can say the chairman of the party might speak politically, but it is the National Secretary that makes the party move legally. That is why Anyanwu matters. Now, all that thoughts now, because the real issue was never just about Anyanwu as a person. It was about his office, and this started way back before the Supreme Court judgment. Remember long before now, before 30th April, again, I said Anyanwu was already suspended because the rival bloc inside the party had moved against him. So the suspension fight became one of the central legal pressure points inside this wider PDP leadership war. And this is where it is very important. I have said every part of this conversation is important, but we need to know how to connect the dots. So, Anyanwu was not just being attacked politically, it was attacked institutionally. His office was under challenge, and in the party politics, once the secretary's authority is under dispute, listen guys, the legitimacy of almost every document flowing from that office becomes vulnerable. And that is the real problem. So whatever document Anyanwu sign might be void. Because a party is not just politics. A party is paperwork. So if the paperwork is contaminated, then the politics becomes contestable. This is exactly what happened in PDP. Now, this is where Wike's scam may have miscalculated because Wike's scam treated Anyanwu like a political asset, but the law treated him like a procedural liability. And that is the difference. Because to Wike, it was useful because of the control as a secretary holding the pipeline. But to the law, Anyanwu was dangerous because once his authority was under valid challenge, every process tied to him became vulnerable to attack. And that is why the suspension matters. Because once the court has sustained the legal cloud around Anyanwu, PDP did not just have a faction problem anymore. Now PDP has administrative legitimacy problem, and that is even worse. The faction fight is political, and administrative legitimacy crisis is existential. While the faction light may create noise, the order invalidates the party's action. That is to say, Wike has got a party, but everything the party does is invalid. If that does make sense, because the law is the law. But the law right now is who exactly is the real PDP? Which action of this PDP is legally valid? And that is far more dangerous. Because once the authority of the National Secretary is unstable, who is right now being suspended, the authority of the party itself becomes unstable. This is where April 30th judgment became bigger than Wike's celebration. Yes, the Supreme Court killed the Ibadan Convention, but it also reinforced the deeper institutional crisis around PDP's internal process. Anyanwu sat at the center of this crisis. And that changes everything. And that is exactly what happened. And that is why PDP could not simply move from the Supreme Court judgment to the normal party business as usual. And because of that, that is what forced the next step. And you know what the next step is? The BOT stepped in because the party was running out of valid institutional signatures. That is the point, and that was a smart one. So by the end of it all, PDP is not just having a leadership problem. PDP has a signature problem. And in Nigerian politics, this is where the real power lies. So the BOT led by Adolphus Wabara moved in as the constitutional stabilizer. So PDP is back to caretaker supervision. So if you listen to this point, say power, because this is ridiculous. So Turaki lost the legal battle to Ibadan. Wike lost the fantasy of total control. And the BOT is now the adult in the room. And of course, both parties, one party, do not really trust the BOT. Now, our searchlight is on the BOT. Although the BOT is supposed to be neutral, but how do we define neutrality? It's a truth at a time. Take care and have a nice day.